The sketch appeared on the third day. Sergeant Mara Voss had not drawn it consciously. She remembered picking up the stylus, remembered the bland white surface of the mess hall table, remembered intending to write a maintenance request for the water recycler in HAB 7. What she produced instead was a column, a structure impossibly detailed, ringed with what looked like spooled cable or perhaps a helix of some biological origin, rising from a base plate she had never seen and terminating in a crown of interlocking arcs that her engineering training told her served some function she could not name but almost could. Almost. The way you almost remember a word in a language you studied once long ago, in a classroom that smelled like chalk and warm windows. She stared at it for 11 minutes before she crumpled the paper and dropped it in the recycler. It printed itself again that night in her sleep. When she woke, the drawing was on her palm, faint red marks. She had scratched it into her own skin without waking with a fingernail in the dark. That was the part she never told the first investigators. She told the second set of investigators everything. By then, it didn't matter what she told. The Gath had been watching humanity for 61 standard years before they made formal contact, and their assessment, delivered via tight beam transmission to the UN's Deep Space Antenna Array, was so thoroughly condescending that the human ambassador to the emergency session reportedly laughed. Actually laughed, a short, involuntary bark before she caught herself and resumed her diplomatic expression. The Gath communique described humanity as a grade 4 biological upwell, demonstrating elementary tool use and primitive symbolic communication, exhibiting aggression profiles consistent with unmanaged territorial species, and possessing no evidence of what the Gath termed resonance capability, the innate neurological architecture that, in their taxonomy, separated civilized minds from biological noise. In the margin of her printed copy of that communique, the ambassador had written one word, yet. Contact, such as it was, settled into a cold and transactional rhythm over the next decade. The Gath did not want humanity's territory. They had more territory than they used. They did not want human resources, technology, or cultural output, which they regarded as primitive to the point of incoherence. What they wanted, with a patience that felt geologic, was quiet. Humanity was noisy. Humanity's electromagnetic signature, radio, satellite uplink, deep space probe telemetry, the sheer accidental leakage of 9 billion living organisms going about their frantic, chattering, meat-based existence, gave the Gath what their translation protocols rendered as an irritation consistent with proximity to an unshielded reactor. What they wanted, in other words, was for humanity to stop. What they got instead was Sergeant Mara Voss drawing a structure she had never seen in the maintenance logbook of the Survey Corps' Forward Station Holt. 3 light minutes off the Jovian ecliptic, on a Tuesday, in a year when no one yet understood what any of this meant. Forward Station Holt had been operational for 7 years. Mara had been posted there for the last 2. The population was 26, 12 Survey Corps regulars, 8 scientists from the Joint Interstellar Research Consortium, 4 contractors from the infrastructure company that maintained Holt's life support, and 2 individuals whose function was listed in the manifest as observer liaison, whose true employer no one formally discussed, and whose presence everyone informally resented. The scientists were the interesting ones. Mara had grown up in Stuttgart, in a family that considered books decorative, and she had enlisted in the Corps at 17 as an alternative to a future she could see clearly and did not want. 7 years of deep survey work had given her a practical education that she valued more than any classroom: orbital mechanics, equipment repair, emergency medicine, the 1,000 small competencies of keeping human beings alive in places that did not want them alive. What she had not expected was that 2 years at Holt would give her a genuine hunger for the theoretical, for the questions that did not have service manuals. The scientist she talked to most was Dr. Yusuf Okafor, a quiet Nigerian-born physicist who specialized in what he called non-local signal architecture. Essentially, the question of whether consciousness could transmit information across distance without physical medium. His office was a catastrophe of printed papers, half-filled coffee cylinders, and handwritten equations covering every available surface, including, on one memorable occasion, his own left forearm. He worked obsessively, slept poorly, and had a habit of going silent in the middle of conversations, not because he was being rude, but because something had just occurred to him, and courtesy had temporarily vacated the premises. Mara liked him immediately. She told him about the sketch on the 4th day, not the one on her palm, that she kept to herself, not from dishonesty, but from an instinct she couldn't articulate, the feeling that some things needed more time before they were spoken. She told him about the mess hall drawing, described it precisely, the column, The helix, the interlocking crown, the base plate. Okafor went still. He was good at going still. Most people who worked in deep space got good at it the same way they got good at not reacting when a pressure alarm sounded, until they'd identified whether it was real or a sensor ghost. But this stillness was different. This was the stillness of someone who has just heard, from a stranger's mouth, the exact sentence they have been composing privately for 3 years. Describe the crown again, he said. She described it. He crossed to the wall of equations, moved aside a sheet of printed spectral data, and behind it was a hand-drawn diagram. The same interlocking arcs. Not identical. His lines were thicker, more uncertain, the product of someone working from the edge of an idea rather than its center, but recognizably the same shape, the same geometry, the same implicit function that neither of them could name. I drew that 2 months ago, he said. I was writing a grant report. I stopped and drew that. I don't know what it is. The silence between them lasted a long time. I think, Mara said eventually, that someone is drawing through us. The presence, they settled on that word because the alternatives felt either too clinical or too theological, did not announce itself. It did not arrive. It was quite suddenly, simply there, the way a sound you've been ignoring becomes a sound you hear, a warmth at the edge of thought, a not quite voice, a sensation Mara later described as knowing something you haven't learned yet. It did not speak in language. It conveyed direction, urgency, something that was not quite emotion, but served the same function as emotion in a mind built differently from a human one. It was, she would understand much later, an explorer. Old in the way that stars are old. It had traveled not in ships, that concept was too clumsy, too committed to the idea that distance was the primary problem, but in something analogous to curiosity, moving through minds the way signal moves through wire, requiring a medium, altered by the medium but not contained by it. It had found humanity interesting. This was, depending on your perspective, either the best or worst thing that had ever happened to the species. 3 months after the first drawing, Mara received a transmission from Earth that began with a standard core security header and ended with the information that she was being relieved of duty pending a medical evaluation of unspecified concern. The order was signed by someone 3 levels above her direct commander, which was irregular. The transport would arrive in 11 days. She read the transmission, folded it carefully, and put it in her pocket. She did not tell Okafor immediately. She told him instead of a new development. Over the past 2 weeks, while running equipment checks in the station's outermost sensor ring, she had begun experiencing something that she could only describe as knowing the readings before she saw them. Not guessing, knowing. The precise hydrogen density values, the exact variance in the magnetic current, the locations of small debris fragments in trajectories she should not have been able to calculate without instruments. She had started double-checking by writing her predictions first and then taking the readings. Her accuracy rate over the previous 14 days was 91%. Okafor listened to this with the focused stillness she had come to recognize as his most serious mode. I need to tell you something, he said. 3 weeks ago, I started dreaming equations. Not just dreaming about equations, dreaming the solutions. Waking up and writing them down, and then running them through the sim and finding that they're right. Last week, I solved a problem in non-local signal propagation that I have had on my board for 4 years. I solved it during a dream about my mother's kitchen. Are you afraid? She asked. He considered this seriously. No, that's the interesting thing. I feel like I've been afraid about the wrong things my whole life. And now that something genuinely strange is happening, I'm not afraid. Is that a symptom, do you think? Of what? Of having become a different kind of person. Mara thought about the diagram on her palm that she'd stopped trying to wash away. Yeah, she said, possibly. She told him about the transport then. He went still again, longer this time. They know, he said, probably. How? The 2 liaison officers. He nodded. He had always known what the liaison officers were. Everyone had. The only thing anyone had ever debated was who they were liaising for, the Corps, the Jerk, the UN security apparatus, or something with no public name that operated in the spaces between institutions. The drawing on the mess hall table, 11 minutes she'd stared at it before recycling it. 11 minutes she'd been observed. What do we do? He asked. Outside the station's viewport, Jupiter hung in all its massive indifference, a planet so large it almost qualified as a failed star, its storms older than human civilization, its gravity bending everything that came close. Mara had always found it calming rather than frightening. It was honest. It did what large things do. It pulled. We have 11 days, she said. I'd like to know what we're drawing before they take it away from us. What they discovered in those 11 days reorganized everything Mara thought she knew about the shape of her own life. The presence communicated through the diagrams the way a language communicates through letters, not through any single symbol, but through the accumulating grammar of many. A structural drawing here, an equation there, a sudden precise knowledge of a material property or a navigational principle. And slowly, if you were paying attention, you could see what they were pointing at. Not a weapon, not a map, not a message in any conventional sense. Something more foundational, an energy architecture, a principle by which the gap between matter and the force that moved matter could be made, under specific conditions, permeable. Free energy was the crude human translation, the presence, ancient, patient, committed to the survival of biological complexity across a universe that defaulted to entropy, had been distributing this architecture for longer than Earth had been a world, leaving it in the neural patterns of minds that could hold it, waiting for those minds to build what the drawings described. The Gath knew about the presence. This was the thing that made Mara's blood go cold. The Gath had encountered the presence 600 years earlier. In the minds of a species they designated Grade 7, a civilization of deep complexity and genuine resonance capability. The Gath had been afraid of what the Grade 7s would build. They had not acted quickly enough, and the Grade 7s had built it, and the Gath had spent 300 years learning to operate in a galaxy where another power understood free energy. They had not liked the learning period. They had been watching humanity for 61 years, not because they were curious or condescending, but because they recognized the signs. The anomalous cognitive spikes in individuals, the inexplicable breakthroughs, the drawings that appeared without source. They had been watching for the presence. And when humanity's electromagnetic chatter had started to include certain frequencies, certain mathematical structures embedded in the noise of 9 billion minds, they had understood. The communique calling humanity Grade 4 was not an assessment, it was a warning. To anyone watching from above, this species has not yet developed. Do not invest, do not engage. Let the timeline play out. There were forces in the galaxy for whom Grade 4 meant opportunity. The transport arrived on day 9, not day 11. Mara was in the sensor ring when the early dock alert sounded. She had 2 minutes warning, which was not enough for much, but was enough for one thing. She pressed her palm flat against the station's central data terminal and pushed. She had been practicing. The knowing, the reaching quality the presence had cultivated in her, the ability to feel information the way she felt air pressure or temperature, had a direction to it, like a hand that could extend. Over 11 days she had been learning to extend it not just receptively but actively, to put something in as well as take something out. What she put into the station's data core was everything. The diagrams, the equations, Okafor's solved theorems, the accumulated grammar of 11 days' worth of the presence's slow architecture lesson. All of it compressed and encrypted, not with a cipher she had written, which the transport's passengers could crack, but with a key that existed nowhere except in the neural patterns she shared with Okafor, that existed nowhere except in the minds the presence had touched. If you were not already one of its children, the archive was stone. Then she walked to the airlock and waited. The men who came off the transport wore civilian clothes and carried themselves with the specific confidence of people who have never been told no by anyone with the authority to make it stick. There were 4 of them. The one who spoke first was lean and silver-haired, with a mid-Atlantic accent that belonged to no single country, and the eyes of someone who had spent decades deciding what other people were worth. His name, Mara would later learn, was Director Callum Reese. At the time, he told her his name was Dr. Harrison, which she did not believe for a single second. Sergeant Voss, he said, thank you for your service at this post. We'll need you to come with us for a short evaluation. Completely routine. Where's Dr. Okafor? She said. A pause. Dr. Okafor is being similarly escorted. You'll be reunited at the evaluation center. On Earth? On Titan Station. Very comfortable. You'll have full access to research facilities. Mara looked at the 4 men, looked at Reese's eyes, and understood with the totality of someone who has recently acquired an extra sense that she was not being taken to a research facility. She was being taken to a place where the things inside her head could be extracted, and the extraction process was not going to prioritize her comfort or continuity. Okay, she said. She said it the way her grandmother used to say fine when she meant the conversation was over, not the problem. Titan Station was not comfortable. It was a functional complex built in the 2040s for industrial surveying and repurposed, at some point in the fog of institutional budget transfers, into something that had comfortable rooms near the entrance and considerably less comfortable rooms in the lower levels, behind doors that required 2 independent key cards and were never shown on the official schematics. Mara was put in a comfortable room and given good food and told she would meet with a physician in the morning. The door locked from outside. The window overlooked a processing bay where automated equipment moved in slow, repetitive cycles, indifferent, mechanical, patient in the way that machines are patient, without trying. She ate the food and thought carefully and put her palm against the room's data. Terminal. The station's network was larger and more hardened than forward station Holt's, but the principle was the same. Information has mass in the same way light has mass. Technically, yes, but you have to move fast enough. She moved fast enough. She felt the shape of the system, the corridors of it, the locked doors, the CANSAM feeds, the atmospheric monitors, the maintenance schedules, and she felt something else, warmer, specific. Okafor was in the lower levels, level 6, behind the double keycard doors. He was alive and aware, and when she pushed toward his location, extending that reaching quality, she felt him push back. They had never consciously communicated at distance before, but the presence had been building toward this for 3 months, and all the things it had been teaching them. The architecture, the energy principles, the non-local signal propagation that Okafor had spent his career theorizing, were, at their root, about one thing: that minds are not as separate as they appear, that the distance between two people who have been open to the same frequency is not a barrier, it is a medium. What she received from him was not language, it was a shape, a diagram compressed, information dense, and at its center, a question mark that felt like his voice. She sent back an answer. It was also a diagram. It was also a route. She had 4 hours before the first shift change. That was what the maintenance schedule told her, and the maintenance schedule had the specific reliability of systems no one imagines anyone would subvert, because no one imagines anyone could read them without physical access to the terminal, without tools, from behind a locked door at 11:30 at night. The lock was electronic. She had understood electronic locks for 7 years in a professional capacity. She understood this one additionally in the way she had learned to understand things at Holt. By feel, by the shape of the current, by the close attention that the presence had been teaching her was the most important human quality. Not intelligence, not strength. Attention, the stubborn, specific, patient human habit of looking at a thing until it gave up its secrets. The door opened. She moved through the station's maintenance corridors with a confidence she had earned, honestly. 7 years in the Corps meant she had worked in facilities exactly like this one, meant she knew which panels hid access routes, which pressure sensors needed reset codes, which cameras had rotation patterns, and which had fixed angles. She moved the way she'd learned to move in 0G, which was conservatively, deliberately, with a complete awareness of everything in contact with her body and everything within arm's reach, because in 0G, the wrong movement didn't just cost you effort, it cost you position, and position was everything. Level 6 was colder than the upper floors. The walls here were unfinished, raw polymer over rock, and the lighting ran amber rather than white, which Mara had always found in industrial settings meant you were somewhere the humans were not expected to notice. She found his door by its feeling more than its label. Room 614. She put her palm against the secondary panel and the lock gave way, not because she forced it, but because she and Okafor were already inside the same frequency, and the lock system read the same authorization code in both of them, because the presence's key did not distinguish between bodies. It was not that kind of key. Okafor was sitting on the edge of a cot, awake, fully dressed, with the expression of a man who has been doing equations in his head to stay calm, and has reached some interesting conclusions. Your timing is precise, he said. Maintenance shift change in 3 hours 40, she said. We need to move. He stood. He had a notebook in his hand, a physical notebook, paper, which he apparently carried always, and he had been writing in it. He folded it closed and put it in his jacket pocket, with the specific care of someone protecting the thing that matters most. They took my equipment, he said. Everything I had on me. I know. Come on. They were going to begin the evaluation in the morning. The doctor they introduced me to. He paused. He was a careful man. He chose words like he chose equations, with exactitude. She was very interested in neural pattern mapping, very specifically interested. She asked me before the session ended whether I had experienced any involuntary drawing episodes. She used that precise phrase, involuntary drawing episodes. They have a protocol? Mara said. They've done this before. How many others? She thought about the presence, about 61 years of watching, about a species that had been distributing its architecture for longer than Earth had been a world, leaving it in mines across the galaxy, waiting for those mines to build. She thought about how many drawing episodes might have been reported over 61 years of Gath observation, how many might have triggered the secondary protocol. How many might have ended in rooms in the lower levels of facilities no one was supposed to? No existed. Enough, she said. Come on. They did not make it to the docking bay. They made it to level 3, section C, corridor 7, where they were met by Reese and two of his people, and a third individual Mara had not seen before, a woman in a gray uniform that bore no insignia, who looked at Mara with the specific attention of someone taking a professional assessment. Sergeant Voss, Reese said. He did not sound angry. He sounded the way a man sounds when he has planned for this contingency and is now executing the plan. This is disruptive. I'm leaving. Mara said, we're both leaving. You don't have transport. I don't need it yet. What you have, Reese said, is a neurological anomaly that was observed and documented and that belongs, by Regulation 7 of the Joint Interstellar Research Protocol, which you signed when you enlisted in the Survey Corps, to the institutional body responsible for deep survey research output. I didn't sign over my brain, Mara said. You signed over any research output produced during active Survey Corps service that derives from Corps, facilities, or Corps-adjacent encounters. He said it with the fluency of someone who has said it before to other people in other corridors, on other stations. The presence, we call it the signal, was encountered during your active service. Its outputs, including any neurological modifications it produced, are Survey Corps research property. Mara looked at him for a long moment, at his certainty, at the two men behind him, at the gray uniformed woman whose eyes had not moved from Mara's face since the moment they'd met. Then she pressed both palms against the wall. She had never tried this with two hands. She did not know if it would work differently. It worked very differently. The feeling was not a reach this time. It was a flood. The station's entire network, all of it, every sensor, every monitor, every piece of electromagnetic infrastructure built into the walls and floors and ceilings of Titan Station, opened to her like a room she'd been standing in the whole time and had finally stopped ignoring. She felt the cameras. She felt the comm array. She felt the automated docking system and the atmospheric processors and the maintenance robots in their charging bays and the deep structural sensors that monitored the rock for settlement and seismic activity. She felt Okafor's hand close around her wrist and felt him add his frequency to hers, and the flood became something more structured, not just sensation but architecture. The way the presence's diagrams were not just drawings but instructions. What are you? Reese began. The lights went amber in every section of the station simultaneously. Then they went out. The backup lighting, red, designed for emergency, clicked on at 40% power. Every door in the facility unlocked. Every camera feed redirected to the station's external antenna, and from there to the open broadcast frequency that the Survey Corps used for emergency transmissions, which was monitored by 17 different agencies on 4 planets and 2 permanent stations. The comm system opened. Mara had not planned a speech. She had not planned anything beyond the room and the route and the maintenance schedule. What she said was what she knew, stated plainly in the measured cadence of a field report, because that was the only mode she trusted for things that mattered. She gave names. Reese's real name, which she had pulled from the station's deep personnel archive in the 2 seconds of open access. The facility's classification number, the program's internal designation, Echo Prime, which appeared in 6 budget documents she found in 17 seconds of searching, the names of 3 other Survey Corps personnel who had been processed through facilities under this program, and whose personnel files now listed them as discharged on medical grounds, the physical location of the lower-level rooms, the content of the evaluation protocol, the fact that the presence, the signal, as they called it, was not a neurological anomaly or a security risk but a gift, offered to any mind open enough to receive it, offered for reasons she was only beginning to understand but that had nothing to do with threat and everything to do with continuity. The everything to do with continuity was the part she was least certain about. But the presence was there at the edge of her thought, not dictating, not directing, simply warm and specific and very, very old, and in that warmth she felt something she could only describe as confirmation. She was not wrong. She kept talking for 6 minutes. At the end of 6 minutes, 17 agencies on 4 planets and 2 permanent stations had the broadcast. Reese had not moved. The gray-uniformed woman had not moved. The 2 men had moved slightly toward her and had then stopped because Okafor had stepped forward, and the quality of his stillness in the red emergency lighting communicated something that was more persuasive than any verbal instruction. That broadcast, Reese said, was illegal under 7 separate. I know, Mara said. How's that working out for you? The aftermath was long and complicated and required the participation of lawyers, diplomats, scientists, 4 separate legislative bodies, and a UN special committee that took 3 years to produce a report that confirmed what Mara had said in 6 minutes. Echo Prime was shut down, publicly, with documentation. Reese was charged with 11 counts of unlawful detention and research appropriation and convicted of 4, which was 4 more than anyone had expected. The 3 Survey Corps personnel whose files listed medical discharge were located, 2 in facilities, similar to Titan Station, one in a private neurological clinic in Switzerland, and brought home, which was the word everyone used, even though 2 of them had not had homes they recognized anymore. The gray uniformed woman, whose name was Dr. Priya Chen and who had been the program's primary neural mapping specialist for 9 years, made a different choice. She came to Mara 6 weeks after the broadcast, in a coffee shop in Nairobi where Mara was on administrative leave and ostensibly not talking to anyone connected to the case, and sat down across from her and put a data chip on the table. Everything, Chen said. Every file, every subject, every procedure, every result, everything I recorded in 9 years. She looked tired in the way that people look tired when they have been carrying something very heavy for a very long time and have just set it down. I want it in the record. Why now? Mara asked. Chen looked at the data chip. Because you said something in that broadcast that I have been not sleeping well over. You said the presence offered its architecture to any mind open enough to receive it. She paused. I have been drawing structures in my sleep for 4 years. I thought it was a stress response. I cataloged my subject's drawings for 9 years and I never. She stopped. Mara looked at her steadily. What does it feel like? Chen asked, and there was such plainness in the question, such stripped-down human want under the exhaustion and the guilt, that Mara found herself answering honestly rather than strategically. Like knowing what you didn't know you knew, she said. Like a room that was always there that you just couldn't see the door to. Chen picked up the data chip and held it for a moment. Put it back on the table. There are 14 others, she said, that we found and processed, and she looked at the wall. Some of them are okay. Some of them are not okay. The ones who are not okay need more than a chip. I know, Mara said. We're working on it. She had said it automatically, and it was accurate. In the 6 weeks since the broadcast, there had accreted around her and Okafor a specific kind of group, not an organization, nothing so formal, more like a household in the old sense of the word, a collection of people who had ended up in the same space because the same things had happened to them, and they had not, in the end, been alone in it. 6 of them now, soon to be 14 more if Chen's information was good. The presence was not particular about its geometry. It touched where it found openness. A physicist from Lagos, a survey sergeant from Stuttgart, a maintenance contractor from Manila who had drawn the same helix on every work order for 2 years before anyone noticed. A teenager in Oslo who had won 4 consecutive national mathematics competitions and been noticed by the wrong people. A grandmother in Kyoto who had been creating ceramic structures of inexplicable geometric precision and had attracted the attention of a university researcher, and then, through a chain of attention she had not invited, of Echo Prime. The presence had been touching minds for 61 years. Not indiscriminately. It was very old and had done this many times, and it had learned what it had learned, but in the specific way of something that understood the difference between minds that would receive what it offered and minds that would fear it. Not intelligence, not social status, not professional credentials, openness. The specific human quality of looking at something strange and choosing curiosity over terror. They were not special. That was the important part, the part Mara kept saying in interviews and hearings. And the eventual book that she wrote partly to think it through, and partly because the story needed to exist somewhere that wasn't classified. They were not special. They were just open. They had been open at the right moment, which was a matter of circumstance more than character, and the presence had found them, and what had given them was not theirs. It was meant to be shared, was designed to be shared, was the whole point of the giving. The architecture, the energy principle, the diagrams. The GATH made their second formal communique 3 years after the broadcast. It arrived as before, via tight beam transmission to the UN Deep Space Array, and it was, as before, extraordinarily condescending. But this time, the condescension had a different quality. The first communique had been the condescension of something that believed itself categorically superior. This communique was the condescension of something that was slightly off balance and was using condescension the way some people use volume to cover the fact that the situation had moved beyond what the prepared script addressed. The GATH described their discovery during routine surveillance of human electromagnetic output of anomalous mathematical structures consistent with what they designated signal Contamination, grade 6 threshold, which represented, they noted in careful diplomatic language, a development they considered premature given humanity's current classification and warranted immediate consultation regarding containment options. The UN ambassador, the same one who had laughed at the first communique, read this one at her desk and did not laugh. She thought about the word containment for a long time. Then she thought about what Mara Voss had said in her book, which the ambassador had read twice, that the presence offered its architecture to any mind open enough to receive it, and that the whole point of the giving was sharing, and that the Gath had known this for 600 years, and had spent those 600 years managing their terror of what it meant by managing the people who received it. The ambassador wrote her response carefully. She consulted 17 advisors. She revised it 4 times. The final version was 3 sentences long. The first sentence acknowledged the Gath communique. The second sentence noted that humanity's classification was a matter for humanity to determine. The third sentence said, "We are sharing it." What followed was not a war. This was important and often misunderstood by people who wrote about it later. The Gath did not attack. They were not militarily aggressive in the conventional sense. Their power was structural, bureaucratic, the power of a civilization that had been setting the terms of galactic contact for so long, that the terms had come to seem like physics rather than preference. What they did was exert pressure the way very large, very old things exert pressure, by existing, by making clear what they expected, by allowing the implications to speak for themselves. What they expected was compliance. What they implied was that non-compliance would result in humanity's exclusion from galactic trade networks, from the communication infrastructure that connected the dozen inhabited systems the Gath had contact with, from the resource-sharing agreements that, while humanity currently operated at the margin of, could become significant within a generation. They expected this pressure to work because it had always worked. Every species they had contacted at the signal contamination stage had capitulated, had agreed to the containment protocols, had turned over the touched individuals, and dismantled the programs the presence had seeded, and gone back to the acceptable trajectory of a grade 4 civilization, moving on schedule toward the future the Gath had mapped out for them. The Gath expected humanity to calculate the stakes and submit. The Gath had been watching humanity for 61 years. They had studied the electromagnetic chatter, the aggressive profiles, the territorial disputes, the institutional structures. They had built very good models. They had not, it turned out, been paying close enough attention. The first Echo facility went online 6 months after the UN's third sentence response. Not a military installation, not a research complex in the classified sense of the word, a house, essentially. A large one on the outskirts of Helsinki, with a greenhouse and a workshop, and an annex that had been a barn, and had been converted with the participation of a structural engineer from Porto, who had been drawing foundations in his sleep for 8 months. 14 rooms, each one designed not to maximize efficiency or security, but to maximize the specific quality the presence valued: openness, good windows, acoustic properties that deadened ambient noise, a library that had been stocked partly with scientific texts and partly with whatever individual residents had asked for, because the presence had been very clear, in the reaching warmth of its consistent communication, that what it needed from humanity's touched was not uniform processing, but the full texture of individual human minds. It needed them to stay human. That was the whole point. Mara ran it. She had not wanted to run it and had said so clearly to the 4 people who had asked her to, and eventually, under the specific pressure of being needed by people she cared about, said yes, on the condition that she retained her Survey Corps rank and kept a dual posting, because she had not joined the Corps to stop being a field technician, and she was not going to. Okafor was there, of course. He had a proper office now, walls still covered in equations, a coffee machine that worked reliably, and a view of the greenhouse, where 3 of the residents had started growing things competitively, which he found soothing. He continued to dream solutions. He had filled 12 notebooks since Titan Station and started on a 13th. The theorems he was working toward had no immediate practical application, and he was not concerned about this. The presence had communicated clearly, through years of drawing and the slow education of touch, that the architecture was a foundation, not a finished building, and the building would take as long as it took. Chen was there. This had not been an obvious outcome. She had spent 18 months in a difficult place, not legal jeopardy exactly, but a kind of moral accounting that she took seriously and that the others, to their credit, had not rushed. When she arrived at the house in Helsinki, she came with the 14 files and 9 years of documented research in a very small suitcase, and she sat in the kitchen for the first evening and answered every question anyone asked her directly and without self-protection. And at the end of the evening, Mara had put a cup of tea in front of her and said, "We start tomorrow," which Chen had understood correctly to mean that the accounting period was over. The contractor from Manila was there, the teenager from Oslo, who was not a teenager anymore, the grandmother from Kyoto, who had brought her kiln, 5 others whose names the public version of events did not record because they had not consented to being recorded, and whose privacy was one of the 6 non-negotiable principles Mara had established in the House's founding document. The Gath continued to exert pressure. The pressure had effects. Trade negotiations stalled. A joint research program with a Gath-adjacent species called the Hethri was suspended. 2 deep survey missions were denied the navigational data that would have made them significantly safer. These were real costs, and Mara did not pretend otherwise in her annual briefings to the UN committee that maintained oversight of the House and the program. What she also showed them in those briefings were the drawings, not the abstract architectural diagrams. Those were restricted, both for practical security reasons and because their full implications for Earth's energy systems were still being worked out, and the timing of that working out mattered. What she showed them were the other drawings, the ones the residents made without being asked, in the margins of notebooks and on the backs of envelopes and in the wet concrete of a newly poured walkway in the greenhouse garden. Because the contractor from Manila had seen the shape and could not help it. The ones that were not blueprints but something else. Records, perhaps, of what it felt like to have been touched. Maps of a sensation that had no prior cartography. Some of them were beautiful in a way that was hard to articulate. All of them were entirely unmistakably human. Not the presence's geometry made flesh. That geometry was there, embedded, structural. But the presence's geometry filtered through specific human hands, specific human histories, specific human ways of holding a pen or pressing clay or setting a finger in wet concrete because you looked at the shape of what was coming and could not wait. The UN committee chairman, a Norwegian parliamentarian who had spent his career on defense appropriations and climate infrastructure, and who was, by his own description, not a sentimental man, looked at a particular drawing by the grandmother from Kyoto for 3 minutes during one briefing. It was a small thing, a ceramic tile actually, not a drawing. A square of stoneware maybe 10 centimeters across, with a design pressed into it before firing. The presence's interlocking arcs at the center resolved at the edges into a pattern that could have been taken for traditional Japanese decorative geometry if you weren't looking closely. The chairman looked closely. "This is what they want to contain," he said. "Yes," Mara said. "That's not going to work," he said. "No," Mara said. "It isn't." The second echo facility opened in Mombasa, the third in Medellin. The fourth, this caused some diplomatic difficulty. In a Survey Corps orbital platform, which meant it was technically in international jurisdiction and beyond the reach of the Gath-influenced pressure that had been affecting the terrestrial facilities' supply chains. By the time the fourth facility opened, there were 63 residents across all sites. By the time the fifth opened, a boat actually, a research vessel registered in international waters, there were 112. The numbers grew, not because the program was recruiting, but because the presence, which had been touching minds for 61 years and waiting for exactly this, for a moment when the touched could find each other, when the infrastructure to receive them existed, when humanity had decided to share rather than contain, had not stopped touching minds. It had, if anything, leaned in. The Gath's third communique was different in tone from the first two. It was longer. The diplomatic language was intact, but the logic underneath it had changed. From the certainty of the first, the slight disorientation of the second, to something that Mara, reading it at her kitchen table in Helsinki, with Okafor standing behind her reading over her shoulder, could only describe as recalculation. The Gath were very old. They had been doing this for a very long time. They were not, in the end, evil. That was too simple, required too much reduction of what they actually were. They were old and frightened and had constructed, over centuries, an elaborate system for managing their fear by managing the rate of change in the galaxy around them. They had seen what unmanaged change looked like in the period before their management systems existed, and the memory was not abstract for them. What the third communique contained, under the diplomatic language and the continued expression of concern about signal contamination, was a question. It was not phrased as a question, but Mara had learned to read the shape of things, and the shape of this was a question. And the question was, how are you going to use it? They want to know if we're going to do what the grade 7s did, she said. What did the grade 7s do? Okafor asked. I don't know. They didn't say. I think, he said, that whatever the grade 7s did, we are not going to do it in the same way. Because we are not the grade 7s. We are, he paused, choosing words, a specific kind of mess. The Gath would say that's the problem. The Gath, he said, have been trying to manage the specific kind of mess that is biological complexity for 600 years, and they have succeeded in making everyone in their managed zone very orderly and very frightened, and very much not going anywhere unexpected. He picked up his coffee. I think the specific kind of mess is the point. I think that is what the presence understood. It is not looking for orderly minds. Orderly minds already know where they're going. Mara thought about this. About the grandmother from Kyoto, pressing the presence's geometry into clay with her thumbs, making it hers, making it something that could sit on a shelf and be given to a grandchild. About the contractor from Manila who had not understood a single equation Okafor had ever written, and who had nonetheless produced structural designs, working from pure intuition and the reaching quality that the Engineering Review Board had called unprecedented. About the teenager from Oslo, she kept thinking of him that way, though he was 26 now and had a doctorate, who had one afternoon simply sat down at the piano in the Helsinki House's common room and played for 3 hours, something that no one present could identify, that drew people in from the greenhouse and the workshop and the upper rooms, that ended with everyone in the common room sitting in a silence that was not empty. We'll tell them, she said. We'll tell them what we're going to do with it. Not because we owe them an answer, but because knowing we're going to answer might. She stopped. The presence isn't afraid of them. I think it's been waiting for someone not to be afraid of them. For how long? A long time, she said. A very long time. The response to the third communique took 6 months to draft. It was written by a committee that included Mara Okafor, the UN ambassador, 3 members of the oversight committee, 2 residents of the Helsinki facility, the captain of the research vessel in international waters, and Chen, who had by this point become the foremost expert on the psychological experience of the presence touched and whose contribution to the response was both scientific and, in the particular way that she had, of combining precision with the awareness of having been on the wrong side of a line, moral. The response was 40 pages long. It described the energy architecture in terms the Gath would understand without providing the specific implementation details, because the implementation was still in progress, and sharing the details prematurely would be incorrect in a different way than containing the details permanently. It described the communities of touched individuals and what they were building. It described what Mara had come to think of as the actual gift, not the energy principle, which was in some sense just physics, just a door, but the change in the minds of the people who had received it. The specific human texture of that change, the grandmother's tiles, the contractor's intuitions, the musician's 3 hours in the common room, the physicist's dreaming solutions, the way human minds, when open to the presence's frequency, did not become less human, but more curious, more specific, more stubbornly committed to the small, beautiful, particular things that had always been humanity's most genuine output. The last section of the response addressed the Gath's implicit question directly. What was humanity going to do with the architecture? The same thing, the response said, that humanity did with every overwhelming gift it had ever stumbled into. Argue about it, make it strange, put it in clay and piano music and equations dreamed in the night. Use it for things that made sense, and things that seemed to make no sense, and some things that would turn out, in hindsight, to make the most sense of all. Distribute it not through managed programs or institutional protocols, but through the specific, stubbornly human mechanism of one person showing another person's a drawing and saying, look at this, I don't know what it is. But look, the Gath's fourth communique, which came 18 months later, which was faster than any previous response interval, which the UN communications team noted with interest, was the shortest of all. 4 sentences in Gath diplomatic register, which translated as, we have reviewed your response. We do not have a framework for what you are proposing. We are requesting a meeting of technical representatives to discuss implications. We are also requesting information on the individual designated in your documentation as the grandmother from Kyoto regarding the ceramic artifact described in Appendix D. Our Cultural Preservation Division has interest in the geometric synthesis she has achieved. Mara read this at her kitchen table and laughed. Not a short, involuntary bark, a real laugh, full and surprised, the kind that arrives before you can decide whether it's appropriate, the kind that means something was funny in a way that went all the way down. Okafor read it over her shoulder and made a sound that was technically not a laugh, but was in the same family. They want to talk to Keiko, he said. They want to talk to Keiko about her ceramics. They have a cultural preservation division. The Gath, Marfa said, have a cultural preservation division. They looked at each other. There was a silence that was not empty. I'm going to put the kettle on, Okafor said. Keiko Yamamoto, age 74, nei Nakamura, retired ceramic artist from Kyoto, Japan Earth, did not find the request from the Gath Cultural Preservation Division particularly surprising. She had been making things for 50 years and had observed that when you made things with genuine attention, with the full, patient, stubborn human quality of attending to the specific properties of specific materials in specific moments, the things had a way of reaching people. This was not mystical, it was craft. It was what craft was for. She agreed to the meeting. She brought 6 tiles, chosen not for their complexity, but for what she considered their honesty. The pieces that had given up most easily, that had happened with the least resistance, where the presence's geometry and her own habitual language had found the shortest path between them. She also brought, wrapped in a cloth at the bottom of her bag, the first tile she had ever made after the presence touched her. It was the simplest, and she almost hadn't brought it, but the reaching quality, which she had trusted for 5 years now, said bring it, and she had learned not to argue with that. The meeting was held on a neutral station, not Titan, which had been decommissioned as a facility and converted into an open research hub, but a different station, older, quieter, in a location that required 3 days of travel from Earth and was therefore, she supposed, considered appropriately serious. The Gath cultural preservation representative was not what she had expected. She was not sure what she had expected. Something larger, perhaps. Something that communicated power more explicitly through physical form. What she got was an organism roughly the size and shape of a large dog, covered in something that was not quite scales and not quite feathers, but served a similar integumentary function with 4 manipulative appendages and a sensory cluster at the anterior end that oriented toward her the moment she entered the room with the focused stillness of something paying genuine attention. She set the 6 tiles on the table between them. The Gath representative sensory cluster moved across each one, did not touch, waited, Keiko noted, for her nod before extending an appendage to the nearest tile and touched it with what she could only read as care. The same care she used when handling finished pieces, the care that came from understanding that made things accumulated something from the making that could not be replaced. They communicated through a translation system that rendered Keiko's Japanese into Gath signal patterns and back again, and it was imperfect. Many things were lost. Some things were made strange by the transit, but less imperfect than she had feared. The representative's first question, rendered into Japanese with the specific phrasing of someone working from a very good but not quite native vocabulary was, how long did this take? Not how did you make it? Not what does it mean? How long? This one, she said, touching the tile she had almost not brought, took about 20 minutes. I have been making tiles for 50 years, but it was the first one I made where I was not trying to make anything. I was making my morning tea, and I had wet hands, and the clay was sitting on the counter, and she made a gesture with her hands that she hoped translated. The representative's sensory cluster oriented to her hands, then back to the tile. In 20 minutes, it said, through the translator, you produced a harmonic geometry that our analysis division has categorized as 5th-order precision. I didn't know that, she said. I just thought it was a nice tile. Another silence. The representative touched the tile again, set it down. Its posture changed in some way that she couldn't have described anatomically but read clearly as a kind of reconsideration. The adjustment of someone who has been holding a model of the world and has just encountered a datum that the model does not explain. The signal, it said, in our framework is a transmission protocol. Technical, precise. It conveys architectural information to minds of sufficient complexity. We have studied it for 600 years. A pause. The sensory cluster moved to the last tile, the most complex, the one that had taken 3 weeks. It has never produced this. What has it produced? Keiko asked. Correct solutions, the representative said. Clean architecture. Functional energy systems. The things you described in your government's communication, the equations, the structural principles. These are what the signal produces. Those too, she said, in our physicist, in some of the others. She thought of Okafor's notebooks, the equations accumulating in the neat, compressed handwriting of someone who didn't want to waste space. But also this, because she paused, looking for the right word, we're also this. We're not just the part that solves things. We're also the part that makes things for no reason. The representative held very still for a long time. No reason, it repeated, not skeptical. Something that might have been wonder. Or reasons that don't go anywhere useful, she said. Reasons that are just you made a thing and it existed and then someone saw it and felt something. And maybe that's a reason, but it's not the kind that goes in a report. She pushed the first tile, the 20-minute tile, the morning tea tile, across the table. Keep it, she said, for your cultural preservation division. The representative looked at her. Its sensory cluster was very still. You are giving this to us, it said. That's what you do with things you make, she said. You give them. The meeting between Keiko Yamamoto and the Gath Cultural Preservation representative lasted 4 hours, which was 3 hours and 50 minutes longer than the scheduled agenda. The transcript, when it was eventually released, was studied by linguists, anthropologists, xenobiologists, ceramic artists, and at least one AI philosophy research group that spent 2 years arguing about the implications of one particular exchange. It was not, in any formal sense, a diplomatic turning point. It produced no binding agreements and altered no policy positions. What it produced was a document, the transcript itself, along with images of the tiles, along with a recording of Keiko's voice, describing the 20-minute tile, and using the phrase reasons that don't go anywhere useful, that circulated widely, for reasons that were not strategic, and that reached, in the following years, audiences that the diplomatic communiques never had. The Gath Cultural Preservation representative requested a follow-up meeting. Then another. It began, according to the translated communications, asking questions that its analytical division flagged as outside its formal remit, questions about the process, about the experience of making, about what Keiko's teacher had told her, about why certain clay bodies behaved differently. It shared in the fourth meeting a record of something made by a grade 7 individual 3 centuries earlier, a mathematical structure rendered in a medium the Gath called resonance fixed sound, which was approximately music in the way that a blueprint is approximately a house. It had been in their archive for 300 years. No one had asked the Cultural Preservation Division about it. They listened to it together, Kiko and the representative in a small room on the neutral station with the translation systems switched off because neither of them needed it for this, she cried, which she had not expected. The representative was still for a very long time after, and then made a sound that the translation system, when they turned it back on to discuss what they had heard, rendered imperfectly as loss. I'm sorry, Keiko said. We preserved it, the representative said. For 300 years, we believed preservation was the correct response. She thought about this, about the long Gath project of preservation through management, about 600 years of keeping the rate of change to what could be predicted and contained, about a sound in an archive that no one had listened to, and what that said about the difference between preserving a thing and keeping it alive. Preservation isn't the same as sharing, she said. No, the representative said. We are beginning to understand that. Mara was 51 when the 5th Echo facility opened, and 53 when the Gath formally withdrew the containment recommendation. The withdrawal was quiet. A single communique to the UN, no announcement, no ceremony. It was, diplomatically, described as a recalibration of risk assessment parameters in light of emerging data. The emerging data was not officially the tile or the transcript or the sound from the grade 7 archive. Officially, the emerging data was the preliminary results of the energy architecture implementation, which had been demonstrated in 3 pilot sites to produce free energy at scales that resolved without drama or fuss. 4 of the 7 most significant contributors to Earth's climate crisis. Unofficially, the emerging data was everything else. Mara read the withdrawal communique at her kitchen table in Helsinki. The same table, the same kitchen, which had accumulated over 8 years the particular character of a space where important things happened regularly, and was no longer trying to be tidy about it, and did not laugh this time and did not feel triumph. She felt the specific quality of an end that was also a beginning, which was a feeling she had first had standing in the sensor ring of Forward Station Holt with her palm pressed against a data terminal, and everything she knew reorganizing itself around a new shape. She had been drawing again, not the architecture diagrams. Those had resolved themselves, had become Okafor's equations and Chen's protocols, and the contractor's structural designs, and the work of 138 people in 5 facilities and 1 research vessel. What she had been drawing was different. She didn't fully understand it yet. It was not the presence's geometry, or not only that, it was that geometry combined with something she recognized as hers, specifically hers, the visual language she had been developing, without knowing it through 7 years of survey work, through the habit of recording what she saw in whatever mediums was available. Maintenance logs, condensation on viewports, the back of a hand with a fingernail in the dark. She was drawing stations. Not the functional architectural kind. She had drawn enough of those to last a lifetime. These were different. Smaller, in a way. More human-scaled. They were drawing the inside of the sensor ring at Forward Station Holt. Not the instruments, but the feeling of the instruments, the texture of attention required to work them, the specific quality of the silence there that was not really silence, but the sound of everything the instruments were listening for. They were drawing Okafor's face at the moment he'd seen her describe the crown of the structural column and recognized it. They were drawing Chen's hands putting the data chip on the table in Nairobi. They were drawing with the patient stubbornness of someone who has accepted that some things take a long time. The shape of what had happened, not the history. The shape of it, the architecture of events rather than the events themselves. The non-local signal, the thing that connected a sketch in a maintenance logbook to a tile made in 20 minutes to a sound in a 300-year, archived to a Gath representative, going still in a way that meant reconsideration. She didn't know what the drawings were for yet. That was fine. That was, in fact, exactly right. She was open. Okafor knocked on her office door and came in without waiting, which he had always done, and set a coffee on her desk, which he had also always done, and looked at the drawings covering her work surface, and said nothing for a moment, which was the best response. New project? He said eventually. I don't know what it is yet, she said. The best ones are always that at first. He sat in the chair that had become his chair over 8 years of sitting in it. Outside the window, the Helsinki greenhouse was doing what it did on autumn mornings, producing the specific quality of northern light that fell through glass onto growing things and made them look like they were lit from inside. The three competitive growers were visible through the glass, doing whatever they were doing at this hour, moving among the beds with the purposeful competence of people who have found the specific work that uses them completely. Keiko is going to Stockholm next week, he said. The Gath cultural representative is going to meet her there. They want to see the new series she's been working on. I know, she called it. He paused. What did she call it? The uncontained something. The uncontained evidence, Mara said. Yes, he was quiet for a moment. Evidence of what? Mara looked at the drawings on her desk, the station, the instruments, the face recognizing the crown, the hands setting down the chip, the sound in the archive, all of it. That we exist, she said. Specifically, stubbornly, all the way through. He considered this. He picked up his coffee, put it down, picked it up again. That is a very good title, he said. It's not my title, she said. She made it. We make the best things, he said, when we make them together. Outside, the light shifted. The greenhouse growers moved. From the common room below came the sound of the piano. Someone playing, early, something she didn't recognize. Something that sounded like the careful working out of a question that had not yet found its full form. The kind of music that was not finished but was being built, note by note, with a specific kind of attention that is not impatient, because it trusts that the thing being made knows its own shape and will find it. The presence was warm at the edge of her thought. It had been warm at the edge of her thought for 8 years, and she had stopped noticing it, the way you stop noticing the temperature of a room you've lived in long enough. It was there the way something is there when it's become part of the texture of your life rather than an event in it. Ancient, patient, curious about what they would do next. She was curious about what they would do next. She picked up her stylus and began to draw. The word count of a life, Mara had once thought, is not the number of days in it. It is the number of moments where the thing you did turned out to matter in a way you didn't expect when you did it. By that measure, the sketch in the maintenance logbook was a word. The 11 minutes of staring before she recycled it was a word. The scratched palm in the dark was a word. The specific quality of the silence when Okafor showed her his own drawing of the crown, that was a whole sentence. What she had not understood in those early weeks was how many other sentences were already being written. How many other palms? How many other maintenance logs? She found out gradually the way you find out most important things. Not in a single revelation, but in an accumulation of small data points that become a pattern before you consciously register you've been assembling. 1. The contractor from Manila, his name was Dante Reyes, and she would know him for the rest of her life, would know his specific manner of being silent, which was different from Okafor's silence and different from her own, and was the silence of someone who had taught himself to be quiet because being loud had cost him things, had been filing work orders with identical margin drawings for 27 months before anyone flagged them. 27 months. The helix was in the corner of every form, small, automatic, the way people draw faces when they're on the phone. Except this was not a face, it was a precise structural element that Dante Reyes, who had a vocational certificate in life support systems maintenance and had never studied physics, had been producing with the accuracy of a computer-assisted design program since shortly after his posting to a deep survey maintenance depot on Europa. He had not known the drawings were unusual. He had not known they were anything. He drew them the way he scratched his left eyebrow when he was thinking, automatically, without significance. The significance had been assigned by someone else's observation, which had been passed upward through 2 levels of institutional attention before reaching Echo Prime, which had sent a man to Europa in civilian clothing, with a cover story about equipment inspection. Dante had not liked the equipment inspector. He had a finely calibrated sense of when he was being observed for reasons that were not stated, developed over a childhood in a neighborhood where that kind of observation was a survival skill. He had answered the inspector's questions with the specific completeness of someone who is being cooperative in a way that gives nothing away. He had, that evening, stopped drawing the helix on his work orders. He had not stopped feeling it. Feeling was the wrong word, and he knew it was the wrong word, but he did not have a better one yet. The reaching quality, the warm and specific knowledge before knowing that the presence produced in the minds it touched, did not reside in the drawings. The drawings were just its handwriting. The thing itself was structural, built into the pattern of how his mind now processed information about systems and materials, and the physical behavior of things under stress. He had been, since the inspector's visit, significantly better at his job than he had been before it. He did not draw this to anyone's attention. What he did instead was what he had always done when he was in a situation he did not fully understand. He stayed quiet, he paid attention, and he waited. Not passively, Dante's waiting had never been passive, it was the active, calibrated waiting of someone tracking a situation for the moment when action would be useful. When the broadcast from Titan Station went out on the Survey Corps emergency frequency, he had been on his lunch break in the Europa Depot's mess hall. He had listened to the full 6 minutes on his comm unit with his lunch getting cold in front of him. Then he had looked at the margin of the work order he had just been filling out and seen that he had been drawing the helix again, automatically, without thinking. He had smiled at it, the first time in 27 months that it had made him smile. The teenager from Oslo was not, by the time he arrived at the Helsinki facility, a teenager. He was 22 and had a particular manner about him. Composed, slightly remote, with the specific quality of someone who has been treated as extraordinary for so long that he has made peace with the weight of it and decided to simply carry it rather than fighting its application or collapsing under it. His name was Tobias Strand. He had won his 4th mathematics competition at 14, which was when someone from a university had come to his school and then his home, and then 6 weeks later he had been Oscared to a medical evaluation center in Bergen that did not appear on any public registry. He had been in the Bergen facility for 4 months when the broadcast happened. He had been aware, in the reaching way, that something was building, that he was not the only one, had never been the only one, that there were other frequencies in the same register he occupied, distant but real, the way you can feel the vibration of a bass note through a floor before you hear it. When the broadcast happened, the vibration resolved into something specific, and he understood that the distance between himself and the others had just collapsed. The Bergen facility's doors had not been designed to hold someone who could feel their electronic systems the way Tobias could, by then feel electronic systems. He had not used this capability before, partly because he had not been certain it was real, and partly because he had not known where he would go if he left. After the broadcast, he knew where he would go. He left with the same systematic composure he brought to competition mathematics. Identify the variables, establish the solution path, execute. He was at Helsinki inside a week. Mara had opened the door and found him standing in the early November cold in a jacket that was too thin for Helsinki in November, carrying a backpack that he held with the specific care of someone whose bag contains the only things that survived a bad situation, and looking at her with the direct, assessing gaze of someone who has been lied to enough times to have stopped giving the benefit of the doubt to strangers. Mara Voss, he said. It was not a question. Yes, she said. Come in. He came in. He stood in the kitchen and assessed the room. The table, the books, the coffee machine, Okafor's equations on a whiteboard by the window, the greenhouse visible through the glass. He was doing the same thing she had learned to do. Reading a space the way you read a system, feeling for the shape of it. It's safe, she said. I mean it. He looked at her for a moment. Something shifted in his expression, not relaxing. Exactly, but a small adjustment, like a dial moved 1 notch. I know, he said. I've known since you opened the door. He paused, looked at the kitchen as a kitchen, not an assessment problem. I haven't been somewhere that felt like that in a while. She put the kettle on. The question of what the presence was specifically, its nature, its origin, its own history, was one that occupied long evenings at the Helsinki kitchen table for the first 3 years, and never fully resolved. And Mara came to believe that the non-resolution was not a failure of understanding, but a feature of the thing itself. The presence was not an organism in any sense that mapped cleanly to biological categories. It was not a ship or a signal or a program, not a god or a ghost, not a predator or a guardian, though it had qualities that adjacent to all of these at different moments in a conversation. What it was, in the most fundamental sense, was old. Old in the way that certain mathematical principles are old, not recently discovered, but always, having been true, existing prior to any individual mind that had ever perceived it. It had its own kind of curiosity. This was the thing that kept coming back to Mara in the long evenings. Not that it had chosen humanity, not that it had judged them worthy or exceptional or particularly promising among the species it had encountered. It had found them curious, not in the sense of strange, though there was that too, but in the sense of interested, open, the specific human quality of standing in front of something enormous and incomprehensible and choosing to look at it rather than from it. The Gath were not curious. This was the thing that the presence communicated in the slow, warmth of thought way it communicated things that were important. The Gath were not curious. They were intelligent, immensely organized, committed to the survival of their civilization with a discipline that had carried them through challenges that would have ended most species. But their intelligence was the intelligence of systems management, of taking the universe as it was and optimizing within it. They did not have the human habit of looking at a system and asking not how it works, but why it works this way and not some other way, and then following that question into territory that had no existing map. The presence had been looking for that habit. Across the galaxy, across the centuries that it measured in the accumulated record of minds touched and architectures distributed. It had found it in others before humanity, including the Grade 7 civilization, which had built the energy system and become, in the Gath's estimation, a threat. What the Grade 7s had done with their threat status was not something the presence's communication style could convey directly. But in the warmth at the edge of thought, Mara sensed something that she would have called sadness if she were attributing human emotion, and that was probably not sadness, and was probably not human, but was in the same region of meaning. The acknowledgement of an outcome that could have been different. They were not going to be the Grade 7s. This was not a promise she could make to anyone, not to the Gath or the UN committee or the people around the Helsinki kitchen table. It was an intention. But she had learned, in 8 years of doing the work, that intention combined with the specific human quality of attention, the stubborn, patient, detailed attention that was the presence's best reading of humanity, was not nothing. It was not certainty, but it was the closest thing to certainty that the future ever offered, and she had decided it was enough. The energy architecture's first civilian implementation happened not in Helsinki and not in any of the official pilot sites, but in a town in the Philippines called Batad in the Ifugao province, where Dante Reyes's cousin ran a small agricultural collective that had been operating on unreliable grid power for 15 years. Dante had gone back to visit after his first 6 months in Helsinki, carrying a set of schematics he had worked out with Okafor, and 2 of the other technically minded residents over 3 weeks of collaboration, arguing in the kitchen about implementation variables, the way families argue about recipes, with genuine investment and the comfortable competence of people who are doing something they care about. The system Dante and his cousins collective installed was modest by the scale of what the architecture could theoretically produce. It powered 37 households and the collective's irrigation system and the primary school's computing equipment. It ran without fuel, without waste output, with maintenance requirements that Dante had deliberately simplified to what could be managed by the collective's own members, using tools they already had. He had been particular about this. The thing the presence had given was meant to be shared, and sharing meant not creating a new dependency, not requiring external expertise, not building something that functioned only if the people who built it remained in control. He had stayed for 3 weeks. He had shown 4 people how it worked, and those 4 had shown 8 others, and the 8th had a sister in the next valley who had asked, and by the time Dante left, the system was understood by enough people that it would persist after he did. He came back to Helsinki with photographs, and the specific satisfied quiet of someone who has done what they came to do. He put the photographs on the kitchen table. It works, he said. We knew it would work, Okafor said. I knew it would work in theory, Dante said. This is different. He was right. It was different. Theory was what you did before the thing existed. After it existed, you were in a different relationship to the knowledge. You had crossed some line from what could be to what is, and the is was heavier and more real, and also unexpectedly more open. Because now that it was real, it could go other places. It could be modified, adapted, learned from, improved. It was not a solution anymore. It was a beginning. Mara looked at the photographs for a long time. 37 households, the school, the irrigation system. The rice terraces in the photographs were very old. She knew this. The Ifugao terraces were among the oldest continuously cultivated land on Earth, cut by hand over 2,000 years ago, maintained by every generation since, and against them the small installation looked modest, almost invisible, just a cluster of components in a structure that Dante had built to sit low and not compete with the landscape. She thought about the presence's age, about 600 years of the Gath's managed galaxy, about 2,000 years of rice terraces maintained by hand, because that was what you did with something worth keeping. About 20 minutes of wet clay on a kitchen counter producing a geometry that 3 centuries of Gath cultural preservation had filed away and never listened to. We need to do 37 more, she said. More than that, Dante said. A lot more than that. Okafor agreed. They sat around the kitchen table, Mara and Okafor and Dante and Tobias, who had come in quietly from the common room and sat at the end of the table in his particular composed way, and Chen, who was on her second coffee and making notes, and Keiko, who was shaping something small and wet in her hands as she listened, and they began to plan. The presence was warm at the edge of all their thoughts, not directing, not instructing. Present the way weather is present, not commanding, but shaping the conditions in which everything else happened. Very old, very patient. Curious, always curious, about what they would do next. They talked until the light changed and the greenhouse went dark, and Dante got up to make more coffee without being asked, knowing the shape of what the evening required, and came back and set the cups down and sat back down, and they kept talking. This was how it happened, not in a declaration or a victory or a moment of triumph that resolved everything cleanly. In a kitchen in Helsinki, in late autumn, with people who had found each other through the specific accident of being open at the right moment, making plans for something larger than any of them. In the company of something larger still, warm and patient, and watching with the ancient interest of a mind that had been doing this long enough to know that the most important things were not the outcomes, but the moments, the conversations, the drawings, the hands in clay, when human beings were most fully and stubbornly themselves. Outside, the first snow of the season was beginning to fall on the greenhouse glass. Inside, the coffee was hot. The plans were good. The work was not finished and would not be finished, not in any of their lifetimes, possibly not in many lifetimes, but it was underway. And that was the thing the presence had been waiting for, had been seeding toward through 61 years of careful attention to the minds of a species that was noisy and messy and frightened and brave and could not, it turned out, be managed. That was the whole thing. That was all of it. That was why. They could not be managed, and the universe, patient and enormous and indifferent to the preferences of those who tried, had noticed. There is a kind of courage that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with raised voice, or clenched fist, or the particular body language of someone who has decided to be brave. It arrives quietly, in the middle of ordinary actions, pressing a palm against a wall, picking up a stylus, opening a door, sitting down at a kitchen table, and beginning to plan. It wears the clothes of routine. It uses the same hands that make coffee and scratch margins and carry backpacks that are too light because most things have been left behind. Its sound, if it has a sound, is not a battle cry. It is the particular quality of silence that falls when a group of people have understood what they are doing and why and have decided to continue. Mara Voss understood this kind of courage better than she understood most things. She had encountered it first in herself on Titan Station, 6 minutes of field report into an open frequency, watching Reese's face for the specific moment when the situation moved beyond what his prepared script could address. She had encountered it afterward in others, in Dante's 27 months of silent drawing, in Tobias's systematic November departure from Bergen, in Chen's data chip on a Nairobi cafe table, in Keiko's 20 minutes of wet hands and unheld back geometry. It was not exceptional. That was the important part, the part she kept coming back to in the book, and in the hearings and in the long kitchen conversations. It was not exceptional. It was available. It required only the specific human qualities that had always been available to anyone who chose to exercise them. attention, stubbornness, and the willingness to be curious about a thing rather than afraid of it. The Gath had spent 600 years believing that these qualities could be managed, that the right combination of institutional pressure and controlled information and carefully calibrated consequences could reliably produce compliance in minds that might otherwise choose otherwise. They were not wrong, exactly. It had worked repeatedly on species and individuals both. What they had missed was the specific combination that human minds, when touched by something that offered them an honest expansion rather than a managed narrowing, had a tendency to choose the expansion even when the cost was high. Not all of them. This was also important, and also something Mara kept saying, not all of them. Echo Prime had operated for a decade with the cooperation, or at least the acquiescence, of a significant number of people who knew what it was doing. The institutions that had applied the pressure after the broadcast had not been populated by monsters. They had been populated by people doing what people do when embedded in institutions, which is follow the protocols and protect the system, and trust that the people who designed the protocols had reasons for them. This was not evil. It was ordinary, and ordinary things, Mara had come to understand, were not overcome by extraordinary people. They were overcome by ordinary people who had decided, at a specific moment, to pay attention. The presence had been paying attention for a very long time. It had watched species rise and find the architecture and build what could be built, and then, sometimes, have what they built taken or suppressed or simply stopped by the weight of older powers with vested interests in the status quo. It had watched the grade 7s and felt whatever it felt, which was not sadness but was in that territory. It had found humanity and watched for 61 years with the patient curiosity of something that has learned not to assume outcomes, and has also learned that outcomes are never fully determined until they are. It had not chosen humanity because humanity was exceptional. It had, Mara thought in the privacy of her own long consideration of the question, chosen this particular moment in humanity's development because humanity was at the specific point where the question was still genuinely open. The point where it could go either way, toward the managed, the contained, the cautious optimization within known parameters, or toward the open, the shared, the stubborn insistence on looking at the thing directly and bringing others along to look. She did not know if that was right. She would never know if that was right. The presence communicated warmth and direction and confirmation, but not explanation, had never offered a theoretical framework for its own decisions, and she had long since stopped expecting one. What she had instead was the work, which was real, and the people who were real, and the growing number of installations in rural Philippines and southern Kenya and northern Manitoba, and a fishing community in coastal Chile that were quietly, without ceremony, resolving the single largest threat to the continuation of human civilization on Earth. That was also a kind of answer. The piano in the common room was a second-hand upright that had belonged to a previous tenant of the building and had been left behind when the facility was established, either because it was too heavy to move or because the previous tenant had understood, in the way that some people understand some things without being able to explain why, that the piano belonged in this specific room with its good windows and its view of the greenhouse. It had been tuned once in the first month by a resident who turned out to have been a piano technician before the presence had found her, and had been played regularly since by various residents with various levels of technical proficiency, none of whom were trying to impress anyone. The best pianist in the house was Tobias. This was not surprising. He was the best at most things that involved complex pattern recognition, which was the character of his particular relationship with the presence, and music at the technical level was a pattern problem. But what was surprising, to people who expected technical expertise to produce technical performance, was what he sounded like when he played. He did not play with the precision of a competition-trained musician. He played with the specific quality of someone working something out in real time, following a thread of inquiry from note to note the way he followed a theorem, not performing the already known, but discovering the as yet unreached. It was, Mara had thought the first time she heard it from the kitchen, the sound of a mind that was entirely present to the question it was asking. No distance between the asker and the asking. No audience except itself. This was, she had come to think, the most fundamental thing the presence was looking for. Not intelligence, not talent, not achievement or training or the particular credentials that institutions use to sort minds into categories of value. The quality of being entirely present to a question, of not already knowing the answer, of being in the fullest possible sense still open to what the answer might be. The Gath were closed. Not stupid, Their intelligence was vast, and their systems were elegant, and their institutional memories stretched back further than human recorded history, but closed. They had decided at some point in their long past that the correct response to the uncertainty of the future was to reduce the variables, to manage the unknowns, to ensure that the galaxy's developmental trajectory remained within the parameters that their models could predict. They had made this decision from a place of genuine fear. Mara had come to understand this, and it had changed how she thought about them. And the fear was not unreasonable. What they could not manage was the consequence of that decision, that a civilization which spends centuries reducing unknowns eventually becomes its own primary unknown. What the presence was building, slowly, patiently, in the neural patterns of a Survey Corps sergeant and a Nigerian physicist and a ceramic artist in Kyoto and a teenager in Oslo and a maintenance contractor in Manila and 100 others across the generations, was not a weapon against the Gath. It was an alternative. A demonstration, patient as deep time, that minds which stayed open produced not chaos, which was what the Gath feared, but a different kind of order. An order that looked like mess from the outside, from the managed perspective, because it grew rather than being built, because it could not be mapped in advance, because its shape was not determined before it existed, but discovered in the process of existing. A grandmother pressed geometry into clay with her thumbs. A physicist dreamed theorems in his mother's kitchen. A teenager followed a musical question from note to note in a common room in Helsinki while the first snow of winter fell outside. The universe, enormous patient, committed to complexity over entropy, which was the deepest and oldest argument for hope, had been paying attention to all of it. So had the Gath now. So had everyone.